All right, everyone, let's talk hiring, the good, the bad, and how to make it way better. Our first speaker knows the ins and outs of recruiting in open source with over a decade of experience helping companies find and keep top talent. She's all about making the hiring process smoother, clearer, and more candidate-friendly, even when resources are tight. If you want to attract great people and keep them coming back, this is the talk for you. Give it up for Mary Kypreos with Candidate Experience Done Right, Practical Strategies for Open Source Hiring Teams.
Excited. Well, thank you. I'm super excited to be here and very nervous at the same time. It's been a long time since I've done a talk. But I'm really excited to share my thoughts on a subject I'm particularly passionate about, which is candidate experience. Because whether positive or negative, it can really have a tangible impact on a company's reputation and future ability to hire. And I think with some planning and a little bit of automation, it is very possible to ensure an overall positive candidate experience. A lot of what you're going to learn about me today is directly correlates to how I can manage dozens and dozens of candidates at one time in various stages. And it's things I've learned over the years or I've learned from other recruiters. And these are strategies that have definitely helped me take candidate experience to really high numbers, right? Admittedly, I have not always worked at companies that tracked candidate experience via surveys, but when we have, using these strategies has shown a consistent and clear advantage. At one company, I was able to improve candidate experience scores drastically within the matter of a month or two, and at another company, we maintained high candidate experience scores over multiple recruiters, every department, every team. But to me, I think the most telling number on a candidate survey score is the non-hired number, right? Where while there is a natural tendency towards disappointment, when someone is not hired, it doesn't have to change their overall impression of the company whether they'd apply again. You're also going to discover I really like beavers, which is good since I work at DBeaver, so I had a little fun. So what are the tangible results of a consistently positive candidate experience? Because they very much do exist. The biggest one, especially for open source companies, is attracting talent. In my opinion, open source companies should already be at a huge advantage heading into any candidate experience because it's such a unique community built on collaboration, support, communication, and a shared love of the work. And realistically, if someone already loves your technology, your product, is a user, is a contributor, they're already positively inclined to wanting to be there, assuming things like salary and other things like that work out. And I wish I could quantify the number of candidates, who apply or reach out to me because they love the open source and they want to work there. And that drive and energy is great. You already have a warm candidate. And at that point, all you have to do is continue to build on the positive feelings they already have about you. So I'm just curious, by a show of hands, how many people in this room would reapply to a candidate where they felt they had a poor interview experience? How many would reapply if they felt respected during the interview process? Exactly, right? So, while it might not be the largest source of your hires, when candidates feel respected in the interview process, they feel like it's a place they want to work, they'll typically stay engaged with you, whether that's keeping in touch with the recruiter or hiring manager, or even keeping track of openings. And I've absolutely hired candidates who we maybe didn't move forward with for one reason or another, who kind of stayed in touch and who we did hire later. Like sometimes it's just kind of timing, right? But if they had a negative experience, would they stay in touch? Maybe, maybe not, right? Another tangible aspect of having such a positive candidate experience is the ability to create referrals. And I'm not talking about employee referrals, but I'm talking about candidate and network referrals. I always feel the greatest compliment to myself as a recruiter and to my hiring team is when a candidate we haven't selected to move forward with, passes along referrals, or asks when they can reapply, or asks how they can contribute to the open source, right? All of those things are great. And all of these things really come back to that employer reputation, right? And it can be hard to quantify the impacts of reputation in the short term. You have to be patient. You have to look at long-term outcomes, but you can start seeing, hey, are you seeing a change or an increase in candidate experience surveys? Are you seeing a change in anecdotal evidence from, candidate feedback, from Glassdoor, from built-in? It's really important to start on the right foot, but if you're making an improvement, you do also have to kind of give it time, to see. And I personally found, and I believe, my hiring managers and interviewers agree that it's worth putting in the time to build a positive experience rather than treating recruiting as a necessary evil that you need to get done with as little amount of time and effort as possible. So I guess I am kind of curious. I would love to hear from one or two people of an aspect of an interview you were a part of that was positive and like what that positive trait was in that kind of interview process. If anyone has ideas, no pressure. Anything? Okay, that's fine. This does lead into, though, as I considered feedbacks I've received from candidates on what they enjoyed about the interview process. The things that stood out were things like transparency, responsiveness, feedback, but far and wide, the biggest factor was communication. And this is so important. And there are two really important parts in recruiting that rely on each other when it comes to an interview process. There is internal alignment with the team, and then there's the candidate communication, candidate experience. You cannot build and ensure a proper candidate experience if you aren't aligned as a team. Now, for that reason, I want to briefly touch on this and about how to build internal alignment, so that recruiting can ensure a positive candidate experience. However, it's really not the subject of this talk, right? It's more candidate experience itself. But I did want to quickly share my kind of best practices, mistakes that happen when you don't, consequences, and kind of the biggest best practice is align in writing and live. You should write down everything you are looking for in the role, how you're going to interview for it. Don't wait to do so. Like, I do understand there are times where you might have an opportunistic hire, it's not fully aligned, but hard pass on hiring managers who want to figure out the interview process as they go. No, thank you. Like, it causes so many problems, right? And some of those consequences are things like, I once discovered during a candidate debrief that, someone on the team had no idea what the candidate was supposed to be doing, and they just interviewed this person. Like, I also discovered on another debrief that an interviewer disagreed with the level of coding required for the role. They had been interviewing for that role for months. Like, what does that say about the feedback they shared about past candidates, right? I also discovered during a debrief that an interviewer had been using senior level coding questions for SDE2s. Like, no wonder he was saying no on everyone. Like, it's so important to both document and align as a team in meetings. And when you document it versus relying on memory, it doesn't matter how long the search goes on. Interviewers can refresh as they have new interviews. And honestly, if you hire the role and you need to hire another one 6 months later, you already have all that documentation from the previous search where you can just go through, update for any changes, train new interviewers, and it takes so much less time to get started. I'm a big fan of documentation, FYI. Now, once the internal team is aligned, everyone knows their job, what they're covering in their interviews, how the process is going to go. The next step as a recruiter or hiring manager, if you're functioning as your own recruiter, is to consider how you want to tell the story to the candidate. Think about not only how you want to talk about the company or the role, but also consider what you can share that is not only valuable to candidates, but perhaps reduces your load, builds on their knowledge as they go through the process, versus information overload all at once. And that's really important to me, and I encourage you all to think about, you're gonna have a lot of touch points with candidates as they go through the process, which means you can really build on their knowledge as they go deep in their knowledge as they go through the process. To keep them engaged, to make sure that they're getting their questions answered. Well, let's get into the meat of building a positive candidate experience. To me, the easiest way to do this, or to start with, maybe not easiest, is building out awesome candidate interview prep. Here's the thing, when it comes to communication, I think this is really what candidates want to know. What to expect, how to prepare. I generally find that sharing some information with candidates is better than nothing. Nothing leaves this huge blank in their mind. It leads to a lot of anxiety that I think is very unnecessary. And nervous candidates aren't shining, they're not showing their true skills during an interview. And it can impact an interviewer's impression too. The feedback can be, hey, the candidate was super nervous. I know they were super nervous, but it was really hard to get a feel for who they were because they were so nervous, right? So to me, sharing something, even something basic, gives candidates an avenue to focus and a little bit of takes away some of that anxiety, right, and nerves. And I think often the pushback I tend to receive on kind of building out candidate interview prep is, well, we don't want to give them the answers. Well, I'm not suggesting we go that far, right? At no point do I think you have to. However, I also believe that sharing more focused topics, even sharing the limits of what will be discussed, doesn't mean a candidate has a leg up. There are also so many factors that go into it, and looking at the depth of a candidate's knowledge, where are they strong, where are the limits of their knowledge, how deep can they go, because of those things that are a natural part of interview, it's just never been a huge concern. But I do want to share examples. I mean, I did share my kind of hey, here's what I do at a bare minimum. I actually do the best, or the better and then the best. I don't actually do bare minimum, but I do think there's a bare minimum you should be providing. But I brought a couple examples. I wish I could have come up with better ones, but I don't have examples for everything. It just depends. But I do want to share kind of two different examples I recently created at DeBeaver. And admittedly, when it comes to the standard interview type, a conversational interview versus a skills interview, I do think it's okay to keep it more general, okay to keep it more simple and give them direction on what to expect. Because a lot of these times, these interviews can be open conversations. And while I do think it's important to have a plan and to have some, at least a few questions planned to ask every candidate so that you're assessing them consistently, I still like to leave interviewers flexibility to flow with the conversation, within those boundaries. I feel when it becomes a checkmark list, it becomes very awkward, very stilted conversations, and I don't think that really showcases your culture either. However, even going beyond these paragraphs, you'll kind of notice, especially in the second example, additional information about who the person is, what their background is, aka LinkedIn. If they don't have a LinkedIn, I usually share a little bit. How that candidate could be working with the interviewer post-hire. Are they the manager, peer, cross-functional partner? Is it the same team, same department, different team? All of that actually provides a fair amount of context for them in terms of questions they might expect, and also thinking about how they want to organize in their head how to describe their experience to that person, right? How you describe it to a manager might be different than a peer. It's also going to help them formulate what kind of questions do I want to ask the person myself. So it doesn't have to be fancy, but hopefully you can kind of see the difference that the second example helps a little bit in really kind of just giving them, hey, these are kind of the topics you can expect. Now, preparing candidates for more practical interviews, and by that I mean beyond the standard conversation, so presentations, coding interviews, whiteboarding sessions, role plays. These are the highest stress interviews for candidates, and also a time for companies to really see candidates in action. So if you're asking, I fully believe if you're asking candidates to prepare something beyond a standard conversation, you need to understand they're using personal time to do so, then you should kind of respect that by giving them detailed instructions on how to prepare, what to expect, because we want candidates to shine. Right? Unfortunately, I can't share my full examples here because They're literally like 1 to 2 pages long. So it just wouldn't work in this format. But you can kind of see like how deep I go, into the different areas. In terms of building a role play, you could see a little bit about like, hey, here's what you need to kind of do for the role play. Here's what you need to prepare for the presentation. When we had built out coding interview guidelines at Temporal, we even went into, hey, you need to, for the concurrency interview, understand like these topics, but we're not going to go into these advanced topics. And that's 2 sentences, maybe 3. It's not a lot, but again, it gives people focus. The other thing I do with these interviews that I think can make a really big difference is I always talk to candidates and do an interview prep meeting before anything involving a lot of work like this. Simply because, and what I do is I share the written information ahead of time. I ask them to review it before the meeting so that they can come in and ask questions. If they've reviewed it ahead of time, this could be 10, 15 minutes tops. But then they're able to ask those questions about, hey, what about this? What about that? I also am able to highlight, things I really want to call out, or maybe that weren't in the written instructions. It's really important to just give them that time to make sure they're well prepared and they seem to appreciate it. And if they have questions during that prep session that I don't know the answer to, I'm going to ask the team and get back to them once I find out. And if it's a particularly relevant question, I might add it to the interview prep document after that. And that's how you kind of keep building and building on it until you get this awesome, monstrous thing. But the good kind of monster. Before we move on, I want to quickly emphasize how important it is for recruiters working on the same roles or within the same department to be prepping candidates the same way. You do not want candidate outcome to depend on how good a recruiter is, how much time they spend with someone. In my last recruiting team, we had 3 recruiters and 1 sourcer all working on the same roles. So we ended up over time realizing, we'd built out a shared email and interview prep that went out to candidates, regardless of the recruiter. We had a team where we aligned together on, hey, what are we telling candidates live? How are we answering specific questions to make sure we were kind of doing it in the same way? And then we built out entire internal engineering interviewer hiring guidelines, for all the different interviews, example questions, leveling guides. We really prioritized putting the work in to ensure we had that documentation, process communication for both that present time, but also in case we needed to scale. So we aligned internally, we decided how to prep candidates, we built out those interview prep documents. This is sort of the fun part, right, of starting to add in high-touch methods to stand out, different ways to personalize things, and then you'll see what I get in return is that, because I think even little things really stand out to candidates. What they want is that transparency, responsiveness, respect. Simple things like touching base with them each week if you don't have an update actually go a long way in making them feel like they're not being ghosted. I apologize a lot too when I'm delayed in sending them something, or hey, I was out sick, so-and-so was on vacation, sorry, I didn't realize it. I think that creates a lot of empathy and shows an empathetic culture when you do things that way. I love sending good luck emails. I actually scheduled them ahead of time, mainly because it lets them know you're thinking about them, but also because it's kind of a reminder to them, hey, you have an interview tomorrow. If you forgot, this is your reminder. And sometimes they respond back where they're like, oh, I forgot to put that on the calendar. Can we change it? So then I just prevented a last minute, why did an interviewer or candidate not show up, right? I also like to send how did it go emails after. Usually I try to set expectations on when I could hear back. Sometimes that doesn't work very well. But it also is kind of an opportunity to ask them, hey, what's your initial thoughts? What went well, what didn't? It gives them the time to share initial feedback as well. And there's so many little touch points you can easily employ, right? Especially with a little bit of automation, and we'll get there, that I think do really help kind of show respect, transparency. And again, ensure candidates that even if you are delayed a few days in in emailing them, they don't think you're ghosting them because they're used to you being communicative. I also find that when you do it, they tend to show transparency and respect in return. I do think it's important to find ways to share information outside of traditional calls. We touched on this briefly at the beginning of the talk, but we live in a world where we have lots of different ways to communicate and many options for creating high-touch communication. It doesn't always have to be a live chat anymore, right? It can be email, it can be prepared documents. Like, there are so many ways to build on a candidate's knowledge. But honestly, this is something that comes with time. This is not the most important thing to me to develop in the beginning and put into practice immediately, simply because I think interview process documents, prep documents, day-to-day emails that increase efficiency, templates, those are much more important to start with because they can ensure consistency in both interview or evaluations and in candidate preparation. So those should always come first. And then after that, it's time to look at how can you create efficiencies in the process, to build on candidate knowledge. So I'm kind of curious, when you're talking to a recruiter for the first time, by a show of hands, how many of you ask the following if it's not immediately available information? Like, what's the company size, team size, structure of the company? A lot of people. Tech stack? Anyone? Yeah. Company funding round, stability if it's a startup. You see a lot of nods, yeah. Company values, culture. Yeah. Salary range, comp details. Yeah. A fair amount of these questions are easily predictable, right? So how do we use that knowledge to our advantage? At one company, and this is something I'm starting to build out now at Beaver, but at my last company, we had built out a kind of informed communication campaign that progressively built a candidate's knowledge as they went on. So even before a recruiter call, when they scheduled a call with me, regardless of where they came from, I would send them a one-pager on what the company does, the company history, the funding round, company size. I would send them another one-pager that explained our leveling guide compared to other standard tech companies. Levels.com was awesome for that, or levels.fyi, whichever one. I had a one-pager explaining what each engineering team did, their size, the product they worked on, the tech stack, what kind of work they loved to do on that team, which of those teams were hiring. And usually I included the benefits just to get ahead of that too. So but I had, candidates, I think I don't expect candidates to come to a first call having researched the company on their own, but certainly if I send you 3 pages of curated information, that will take 4 minutes to review, it was very nice because we could get those very basic questions out of the way and spend our half an hour going deeper into what the teams look for, going deeper into the candidates' questions, right? Than kind of that very high level basic stuff. Post-recruiter call, I always send an email. I have a template for this. I've been doing it for years, where I follow up with them. Like right now, I have specific links to learn more about DBeaver. It's usually a mix of mediums. Usually there's a video. Usually there's a customer story. There might be an employee story from their team. Usually something product related, but geared toward their role. I send the job description, even if they've already seen it. And I send a summary of the interview process that we had discussed, just so they have everything in one place, right? Depending on what's built out, like when I was hiring engineering, we did actually include the interview prep documents for the coding interviews and the design interviews, mainly because if we were so strict on concurrency coding, I wanted candidates to opt out if they felt like it was going to be too much for them kind of before we got there, right? During each interview step, we would, provide, again, each would provide an email with what to expect with each interview, and then with the final into prep, for the final interview, in that prep call, I would always do a double check on final deal breakers, resharing company benefits, reconfirming salary. What are your outstanding questions that you haven't gotten answered in the past 4 hours, that kind of thing. So this is where open source can be fun. Admittedly, and this depends a little bit on what your open source project or product is, depends on how you employ this. But when the opportunity is available, I 100% encourage candidates to try out the open source or the free trial. And take the opportunity to experience the technology and decide whether it's something they want to contribute to, right? And the fact that it's all open source code allows us to do that, but obviously be careful with it. Like, as a recruiter, I probably don't know how to download dbeaver and connect to my databases. But support engineer, sales engineer, software engineer, sure, right? But maybe if it's an open source marketing product, well, that's different. You might have other people, so just be careful who you recommend it to, right? But absolutely, use your open source to your advantage. I typically wait until later, like mid to late stage for this, just because, again, like I think in the beginning, sometimes they're not yet invested. So this is that point of there's a lot of touch points. How do you build and deepen that kind of investment? Okay, I'm gonna take a deep breath before we get to this one, because this is obviously a really big flashpoint at the moment among job seekers, companies, recruiters. Should I provide candidates with feedback? Quite frankly, it might not even be up to the recruiter whether they can or can't. We all obviously know the risks to companies about like the legal risks of what might happen. And so some companies just simply don't allow recruiters to do it. Right? Since I've always worked at smaller companies, we've never really had a policy for it. So I'm just gonna go through what I tend to do over the years. And some of what I do does depend a little bit on the scale at which I'm working. Obviously I have a lot more flexibility to put time into candidate feedback when I have 10 candidates versus 50, right? But I do always try to share feedback whenever possible with candidates within reason. We'll talk about shortly how I do that while maintaining everything. But I will also admit on the kind of the risk side, there have been times over the years, and even in this past last year, where I question how much good versus harm I'm doing. And frankly, to the candidate and to my own mental health, because I definitely have candidates kind of argue with me or send very mean-spirited emails to me or just kind of mentally unload on me their frustrations with the job market. And I totally get it, but at the same time, the recruiter's not the one making the decision. We're just trying to be helpful, hopefully, right? So there are times I go back and forth on this, but I haven't given it up yet, so. But I do think, like we discussed earlier, there are tangible impacts, on creating a positive candidate experience here. And I do find that there are times, not always, where one of those things is the ability to giving feedback is having the opportunity to receive anecdotal feedback in return. And that can lead to improvements in the process. It can identify training opportunities, either needed for a specific interviewer or the team. Like, there is a lot of good that can come out of it if a candidate gives you honest feedback in return. So, like, for example, but you also have to be careful at the same time to, like, you don't necessarily act on feedback just because you get it from one candidate. You kind of have to consider, is it valid feedback? Could this have just been a one-off, like an interviewer had a bad day, or they didn't like mesh well with the candidate? So sometimes it's more tracking like themes to see if they come up, a few times. But definitely, like, one time I had a candidate give me feedback that they wished we had offered them a live coding interview instead of a take-home, which we did. We always gave candidates the choice, but I was certainly like, so there was nothing to do with that feedback, and I wasn't gonna remind them of that because that wouldn't have, helped at all. But so you do have to kind of like see where it's going, right? But I also have definitely had times where it was really helpful, because after I share feedback with the candidate, I encourage them, hey, do you have any feedback for me on our interview process, like how we can improve? Interviewing is this live monster, like we're always trying to get better too. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they just have positive experience, sometimes they do share situations that I don't know if they would be comfortable putting into like a survey. Like, we did identify one time that an interviewer their like camera setup was a little bit weird. They had the camera on the laptop and then looked at the big monitor. And a candidate felt like they were not engaged in the interview, that they were working on something else. And this happened a couple times. And I finally went to the hiring manager, and the hiring manager was like, oh yeah, that's just his office setup. We'll talk to him to let him know. The easy solution there, tell the candidate, hey, I have this big monitor here. Here's where I'm monitoring CoderPad with you. My camera's over here. Just know that's my office setup, right? Easy solution. I had another candidate once where they were telling me that the interviewer was completely silent the whole interview. This was like a coding interview maybe, or design, I'm not sure. And came to the interviewer, was like, hey, and it was bad. Like the interviewer, like candidate, like canceled the rest of their interviews. They took it as like, this person was being very disrespectful. Again, they weren't engaged. Like, I'm done. So go back to the interviewer, hey, we kind of got this feedback, what's going on? They were like, well, it's a senior staff interview. I expect them to be able to kind of like work independently and on their own. I'm like, okay, well, I can kind of see your point there. However, one, the point of the interview is to see how they collaborate, how they work with others, how they deal with changes. If you kind of throw in a like, what if we use this tool or not? So we're not really assessing them for the things we want if you're not engaging with them. And second, if you want to go that direction, again, just mention in the beginning of the interview, hey, I'm kind of assuming that you're going to tap me in when you have questions or you get to a spot where you're not sure how to proceed. Otherwise, I'm kind of going to like let you do it, and I'm just going to be watching the CoderPad, right? Simple solution to just tell them, here's what to expect in the interview. But all of these things I gained through anecdotal evidence after I had already gained a fair amount of trust with the candidate, right? So you can't actually find things that work really well. So here is my approach to candidate feedback at the different stages. And it does change. And again, sometimes it'll change a little bit depending on how much time I have. But at the application stage, I always have an automated thanks for applying email, right? And I know as much as candidates want to understand why they weren't chosen to move forward in an interview after an application, admittedly, it's impossible to provide individualized feedback at this stage, just because of the scale of applications. Like, it's actually been kind of refreshing at DBeaver because we don't advertise our roles. So, the amount of applicants that we get in is very low. So I actually am able to provide, I do have a template where I add a little bit of personalization. But that's because we get a few a week and I can keep up with it. At past companies, if I posted an SD2 role, I could have 400 applicants in 3 days. It's like, it takes so long to just get through those resumes and review them. If you had to then individualize something for everyone, that would be hard. But I do have a template, a very nice, pleasant, respectful template. We aren't moving forward. But I see this as a flashpoint sometimes, and it's just, the scale is too hard to manage individualized feedback. For the recruiter screen, like after my calls with them, if we decide not to move forward, typically, I have a base email template, and then I typically like to at least provide them with a piece of positive feedback, and then usually the fact that we've decided to move forward, with other candidates. If I'm able to, or if it's obvious, again, kind of depends on the scale for that week, I might provide a small piece of broad feedback, on why we made that decision. When it comes to first manager calls, I kind of do similar as the recruiter call. Again, it kind of depends. Usually I try to share, hey, this is something really positive that we like, but we've decided to move forward. When it comes to practical interviews that we've talked about, things where they have prepared, I usually do kind of send out, well, again, it depends on the scale. If it's really high scale, because I got to a point in one job where I would give feedback at this stage, live feedback, and it got to a point where I just couldn't maintain it because I was in so many feedback calls a week. So I might try to send them kind of my basic one, and then if they ask a question in return, I'll get on the phone with them. But if I have the time, I will usually offer to discuss feedback with them at this stage. But the big one is post-loop or final interview. I always give the option here. So I always start with a very respectful email template, letting them know that we passed. And frankly, I do it this way because I include an optional Calendly link that they can use to schedule time on my calendar to discuss the feedback, because I don't like to discuss feedback with candidates without preparing ahead of time. So I usually reread all the feedback from all the interviews, maybe go back to their resume if necessary, and develop a few bullet points of, hey, this is what went really well. This is where there could have been improvements. And I usually couch that very carefully because, and this is where sometimes I wonder, is it harmful, is it good? Because things that my company might care about, another company might not. So even when I'm talking about, hey, you stayed too high level, I also say, but at another company, that might be fine. Again, I'm just, trying to, you put in a lot of time and effort, hours. I want to be respectful and kind of share our thoughts. And this is where I get feedback in return, right? And then I ask them. But it's actually quite interesting because I would say a year ago, 90% of candidates would schedule time with me. And this past year, maybe 50%. I don't know if it's just before I was working solely on software engineering, and now it's more of a mix. Maybe software engineers really want to know. Maybe salespeople don't. I'm not sure if there was a change in the market there, but again, I absolutely do not put feedback in email, just because I think I also want to get that feedback in return. And I also don't want to play phone tag with them. And I don't want them to want to force them into it by playing phone tag with them. So if they do not want feedback, if they don't want to discuss it, they don't have to schedule a time on my calendar. That's fine. Sometimes they want to move on. It's up to them. In retrospect, when I submitted this talk proposal, I definitely should have narrowed down to 2 topics instead of 3. So I had a whole third topic in my head about different internal policies, HR processes that can impact candidate experience. We're not going to go through it. So instead of getting into my recommendations or stories here, I'm simply going to leave you with some thought prompts, whether this is, can you or your recruiter explain leveling, how it works, why they were leveled a certain way, what they need to do to get promoted? Can you explain the promotion and review, performance review process? Like, what is it about? Again, how does it work? How often does it come? Can you explain how onboarding works? What resources are available to them? Can you explain how raises work? Can you explain how stock works? Like, thought prompts. If you can't do this, or if you think your recruiter can't, I would start thinking about it. Because I have had candidates decline offers when we couldn't share more specific information about these things. When we couldn't tell them, hey, why did you get leveled as an SDE2 instead of a senior? And if the hiring manager couldn't explain how they were going to get them to that next level. Now, for the last couple minutes, you've already heard me talk about a lot of these things here and there as I went through. Like I said, I am a big believer in getting as close to one-click processes as possible, because there's a lot going on at different stages with, again, dozens and dozens of candidates at a time. So over time, I've developed different ways that work for me. Now, the thing here is, I use an applicant tracking system for this. You can certainly use different tools outside of that if you don't have access to one, if your company doesn't use one, or if you just don't have permissions as a hiring manager. As we discussed, I love email templates. I think you guys figured that out, right? I really love email templates. I literally have one for everything. I probably have 30 email templates in my applicant tracking system. You know, we talked about I have an email template for the first call with me, an email template for after my call. I actually have 3 sub-email templates for this. I have one for if we're moving forward with the candidate, one for if I need to connect with the team, and one for if I want to move forward with the candidate but they want to think about it and get back to me. So literally, I don't even have to change that sentence, you know, at all. I have email templates, you know, for each stage of the interview process that are slightly different, again, that kind of build depending on how much effort they put into it. You know, I have email availability templates for each stage with information on what to expect. I have email confirmation templates with the same information on what to expect. You know, my whole goal with email templates is to go into a system, pick the email I need, click send, all in under a minute in between meetings. And again, you can do this on your applicant tracking system. You can create email templates on Gmail, Outlook. You can use a tool like Text Expander. One of my colleagues just had it all in a Word doc, and he would copy and paste it over. Lots of different ways. While there is definitely a risk involved in letting candidates schedule whatever time they want on your calendar, I do like automated scheduling. And again, like different ATSs offer this. I tend to use Calendly just because I like being able to have a different Calendly link for if it's European candidates that offer earlier times. But like if you're in the US, I'm not waking up before 9 a.m. to talk to you. I'm like, but if you're in Europe, sure. So more times there. I have Calendly template for that 15-minute feedback call, for that 20-minute prep call. There are auto tasks in some applicant tracking systems where you can like set it up so an email goes out when you move stages for candidates. They're very helpful. I don't use them mainly because I'm afraid I'm going to click them to the wrong stage. They're going to get an email they weren't supposed to get, and then I have a lot of explaining to do. So I don't typically use them, but I have people that do. Finally, if you don't have an applicant tracking system, there's lots of different tools you can use to keep track of where people are at in the process. And again, one-pagers are my favorite things in the world, minus email templates. So I do want to quickly say thank you for Scale for having me, all the volunteers who make this happen, the AV staff, Raise Me for sponsoring the Open Source Career Day, and DBeaver for encouraging me to give this talk, because I don't know if I would have otherwise, to be honest, because I'm terrified of public speaking, but I am very open to questions at this point if you have any.
Oh, sure. Hi. First, just want to say thank you. This is, you know, from the other side of the equation, this is really a breath of fresh air, and I you know, would love to be a candidate in your process, and I hope more people would adopt these practices. Just curious, and maybe this is more specific to DBeaver or in general, how do you design, or what are your thoughts on when you do turn down a candidate? Do you have a hard policy on when they can reapply, or more of like, you know, maybe they've reached a milestone and you want to kind of, with more of a high-touch approach, learn what they've done with a project or a contribution? Just curious of your thoughts in that sort of process.
I didn't catch the second part of that, but I did catch the first. And it depends on the company. Some companies do have, whether informal or formal, timelines on, hey, we do like a 6-month break or a year break. Usually I probably do informal of a few months, just because if they're not a fit for this role right now, then I don't want to like lead them on. They might be a fit in the future, for sure, and we could have another role that pops up in 2 months that is a better fit, because sometimes like one of the people that, you know, it was an engineer that I hired a couple of years ago who wasn't a fit at first, because what we needed in that project was a little bit more cloud-based, but the hiring manager was like, the moment we need a second person, this is them. You know, and I was able to we decided to share that with them. And literally like 2 months later, we unexpectedly had that second position open up, and we called him and we filled the role. Like, so I'm not a big fan of hard and fast rules, like, but companies do have them. There's nothing wrong with them. Yeah.
Mine's not a question, it's to comment. I wish more recruiters were like you. I've been watching people get ghosted lately, and your thank you emails, your follow-up emails, I think are great, and I wish more recruiters did it.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm not perfect, to be honest. Sometimes I miss things, but.
Hi, Mary. It's Krista.
I
Nice to
know.
see you again. I don't have a question either. I just wanted to say that I have experienced you as a recruiter from the other side, and going through that experience it's scary always going through an experience like being recruited. But you made it so easy, and everything you said here is really how it felt from the other side. I appreciated all of the communication. I appreciated your care. It was evident. And I never once felt like what happened with the end result had anything to do with you. It was just finding the right match for the right position, right? So I just really appreciated it, and I just wanted to encourage you. You did a great job, and I know that you were excited to do this talk today. And I just affirm you in all of it and everything that you're doing.
Thank you. That's very nice. Yeah, Krista and we were talking about it while we were applying, and I was like, I don't know if I'm like, will be excited if they accept me or not, because I'm so afraid of public speaking, but we'll see what happens. I don't know. So, anything else?
When you're dealing with the feedback conversation around candidates who've been rejected at the manager/technical practicum stage, and the candidate, you're dealing with candidates who have like a long CV. Either they have a history, and they get rejected around like for technical and experience reasons. How do you handle measuring that conversation? Because that's like a very difficult conversation to manage, I find. And there's like a lot of like you said, specific wrinkles, but like, how do you handle protecting their feelings about their accomplishments, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's why I always like to give balanced feedback. Because I always bring positives. It's never about just negatives. I don't like to use the word even negatives. I like, sometimes I'll call them like areas where it could have gone a little bit better, right? Or improvement, because again, in another company, those things might not have been an issue, and I don't want to like throw people off. It's actually a lot easier with technical interviews than it is with like sales or something, which is a little bit more, it's not necessarily personality based, but it's more like anecdotal. I find it way easier with technical interviews because you're usually all able to like come back with, hey, they were just kind of like looking for like a little bit of a deeper discussion around different tools that you could have employed here, or what were the advantages or disadvantages of those different tools, like what were the trade-offs. So usually I can come back with technical interviews with a little bit more like specifics around, hey, like they thought your concurrency coding interview was like, you did a great, I'm trying to like come back up with all the terms again, and like you were great with like mutexes and like, semaphores. Are there semaphores? I don't remember. But they were like, for this level role, we look for kind of deeper knowledge around fill in the blank. I can't think of any more concurrency terms. It's been like a year and a half. So usually it's more like kind of like depth of kind of answers, and sometimes that can go well. And like I said, sometimes people disagree, and they're like, well, I think I still like understand this better. And sometimes I have to just be like, look, I wasn't obviously in the interview. I'm not an engineer. Like I'm just kind of offering this if you wanted it to try. And I don't struggle with it too much simply, well, I do struggle with giving the feedback. It's very awkward and very emotional, but I think people deserve it. But usually I can bring out, like I focus very much on constructive things, not intangibles like you talk too much. So I usually try to bring it back. Usually people feel like it's fair. I often have people come back to me and they'll be like, that's fair. I really didn't get into that. I really don't know how to do that. So usually people are pretty self-reflective and honest about what they're good at most of the time. Cool. Well, I think we are all done, but don't forget to check out all the cool things going on at Open Source Career Day, and I will be in the back if anyone else has questions, or you can find me at the DBeaver booth in the expo hall later too.
All right, everyone, let's give it up for Mary Kypreos. I don't know about you, but I learned a lot. Over-communicate, standardize the hiring process, get the hiring team aligned, and the good luck email, I love that.